So I often found myself having those type of conversations with them to find your strength, but also know that you're human and it's okay to break apart, but there's always another day if you're blessed to have it. You just build yourself back up again, and it takes time.
Hello, and welcome to Awake at the Wheel. Today we're joined by our guest, Shara Ruffin. She is a licensed social worker from Philadelphia, and she's also the owner of Journey to Licensure, where she aids aspiring social workers in their examination process for preparation for it. She provides coaching as well as clinical supervision. So Shara, welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So you've already kind of introduced me already, but I'll say that I also work for LinkedIn as an advisor, along with my other responsibilities of helping social workers with their exams. I'm also a top voice for social work on LinkedIn. So that gives me an opportunity to help educate the platform about social work. And yeah, there are many other things. I'm an author. I'll be a third-time author this year. So I'm very excited about that. So awesome. I'll probably tell more, I guess, as we go, but that's what's kind of on top of my mind. And I'm a former therapist.
Okay. All right. So I would like to start with maybe discussing and providing some context to our listeners as far as the difference between social work, psychotherapy, and psychology, because there's a lot of overlap, but there's also a lot of differences. So generally speaking, a psychotherapist like myself provides assessment and treatment of mental health disorders. Oren, if you want to chime in a little bit about what the main gist of psychology is.
Oh, I guess what's different is that, at least in Ontario, that we have rights that other mental health professionals don't. We can diagnose, and we also do therapy. We educate, as others can as well. And I guess it's also a bit of the education. It's, what kind of training you have, the theoretical orientation, which even within the field of psychology, of course, there are dozens, if not hundreds of different orientations one could have or could be exposed to. So I think it's more about the practice. Like a big part of it is the practice. Again, the ability to diagnose, which other professionals cannot do.
Yes, I do want to put in there that at least in the United States, in some states, not all. I know in Pennsylvania, I have diagnosing power. As an independent licensed clinical social worker getting diagnosed. They're trying to fight for that more in our broader association to have that power to do so, just as would a licensed psychologist would. That is something that's definitely been changing in our field recently. But I would definitely talk about some of the aspects. Interesting enough, I was a psychology major for my first 2 years in college over 20 years ago. And I switched my major to social work because I wanted to practice therapy faster. And I did not want to go the route of getting a terminal degree in psychology, which of course was the PhD, and do more research. It just wasn't my thing. So my advisor at the time said, you should switch to social work. My first thought that, listeners might find this to be funny was that, don't social workers just take away children? That was my first thought. And I was very, very wrong. When I had my first introduction to social work, my first intro class, I fell in love with the field. Hence, I've been in for 20 years. My specializations go from working with psychosis all the way to ADHD combined type. I have 23 specializations in all. I'm a board certified telemental health provider. I was a psychotherapist for half that time in the field. So my range of practice was very broad, but mostly in the mental health setting space. So for the listeners, when I think of psychology, I think of more, it's a broader field when we do focus on there's human behavior. Psychologists focus on exploring a lot of the mental processes, the conducting the research, therapy, counseling, where it kind of overlaps. And also the training is a lot different. Typically, social workers, we go for a bachelor's in social work. A master's in social work is our terminal degree versus a psychologist who goes for a doctorate, which is their terminal degree. For social workers, we only have to do 3,000 hours under a clinical social worker post-grad, 2 years out of grad school, and we're able to get licensed as an independent social worker. So most people are like, well, what does that mean? And typically it just means that we no longer have to be under supervision for practice. We're able to practice independently, whether that is to work as administrator, to go into academia. Hence, we would definitely need our doctorate and PhD in social work, or what we call DSW, or practical degree in social work. But it's very broad in a sense for social work that we mostly work with micro, meso, and macro levels, which means we can work with families and individuals. We work with different organizations, as well as we can be definitely in different ranges of fields and work with different disciplines. So individuals, families, communities, and really enhancing well-being from a more holistic standpoint of integrating a lot of the family dynamics and really the holistic parts of a person. When we look at a person, we're treating them from a strength-based perspective and not really from a medical perspective in terms of looking at the underlying medical issues. We do encounter and integrate them in care, but we're really looking at how can we pull the strengths of the person to help them be resilient, depending on where they are in their process. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a slight overview in terms of that piece. The settings, if I were talking about a social worker versus a psychologist, we're in a lot of wide range of settings. It could be, for me, it was in a hospital setting mostly because I wanted to work in mental health, ranging from inpatient, outpatient, substance abuse. We can be in government agencies. We work in private practice as private practice clinicians if we wanted to, community organizers. Some of us are politicians. Some of us, believe it or not, are professors in an educational setting. So it really ranges in terms of where you'll find social workers. I think in every flavor of society, you'll find a social worker somewhere there. We're often told that we're the backbone of society to a degree, to do the work that others would rather not do. But when it comes to psychologists, from my understanding, it's more so treating the mental and emotional issues related to the psychological theories and capacity developmental parts of a person. Of course, the focus can be different depending on if it's an organizational psychologist or industrial psychologist. There's so many ranges and overlaps, but there are distinct factors between a social worker from a theoretical standpoint and a psychologist based on their training, based on what their focus is and what they're able to do in the realm of their discipline.
Okay, I'm going to jump in for a second, Mal. Just okay, because something that Shara said is actually interesting. So first of all, for the listeners, so I've taught hundreds and hundreds of social work students because they come to my psychology classes, and I have course they have to take, and then courses they take as optional courses. So I have had hundreds, and when I used to do, you talked about isn't the social worker's job only to take children away? Interestingly, for many years, that was one of the main areas of my focus, not taking children away, but doing parenting capacity assessments for child protective services across Canada, Ontario, and for the courts, also custody and access. And in that capacity, I worked with hundreds more. Now, they weren't social workers. They were social work students who got their BSW or MSW, but they were told, I don't know how it is in the States, but they were told never to actually get licensed, or if they did, they let it lapse, because otherwise they would be spending literally all day, every day, fighting off specious, malicious claims or complaints. Because if a parent isn't happy with either the social worker or the psychologist or whoever is involved in their case, they feel they have no other recourse but to take them, to go to their college and try to get justice. So I'm not sure how it happens in the States, but in Ontario, that's quite common. And previously, that was the largest type of complaint was against people in the custody access and the child protective services fields. So.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I know here in the States, child welfare is definitely a critical field here. Even there are a lot of social workers there, but I know in terms of in the U.S., it's still a big stigma with child welfare and some of the barriers systematic barriers that are faced in terms of caseworkers, supervisors, burning out, because that field has a high burnout rate in the capacity that they can work. And I've supervised quite a few child welfare workers in the States here. But our license, at least in the U.S., you have to get a license in order to, it's at a point where we have to get a license at every level in most states in order for pay increase, for us to be able to have any projected longevity in the field. And it's changing for us now even more so that before they weren't really looking at, in some states, the bachelor's and master's license as prevalent as the clinical, but now it's every level that people have to get the license done in order to have any type of career path in social work here. So I think that's really interesting. Now I think our ethics, that still rings true. I think across the discipline, I'm sure even in Canada, someone's always going to, someone's going to claim malpractice. And here, thank God, in Pennsylvania, I haven't seen any malpractice for social workers so far. But I'm sure they're out there. But it's really about really upholding, that license and protecting who it's supposed to protect, the public. It's been a big fight here with the license, which I'm sure is a different story we could get into in social work here. But license is pretty prevalent. We have to have it in order to get further in the career, or we're kind of stuck.
Okay. And Malini, can I say a few more points? Only because, yeah.
Go ahead.
Normally
please,
Malini takes charge, just Shara, but
yeah, no problem.
Right. And so it's interesting because up until the College of Psychotherapists came about in Ontario in, I think it was 2014. Pretty sure it was 2014. It was April 1st, 2014. Yeah. Every student of mine, I'm telling you, Shara, whenever they said, look, you know what, I want to work with patients, or clients, I want to do therapy and so on, but I don't want to spend so many years for the exact same reason you said about doing research. If you get your PhD in clinical psychology, I told my students, it makes you a really good researcher. Like, you didn't get much training in actual practice. That came in practica or internships, but the program itself was mostly focused on research. So I used to tell them, I say, become a social worker, because I said that, they could get, as long as they were registered and licensed, they could practice psychotherapy at the time, which was not even what's the right word here? Protected field.
Protected Act.
Yeah, until I think at the same time as the college in 2014. So literally anybody, and this is also for our audience in Ontario, until 2014, literally anybody could have conducted psychotherapy. There was no oversight of the term psychotherapy. So that really changed in 2014. And Malini is a psychotherapist, and Malini might be able to speak to that. And then the final point before Malini talks about that, just to make sure there's no misconception. So I remember once I was lecturing in one of my halls at, it was called Ryerson at the time, in one of my classrooms, and a social work professor was walking in the hallways with a bunch of high school students who were doing a tour. And I could hear her, and the door was open, and she was saying, she wasn't doing it to provoke me, because I don't think she knew I was there. But she was saying, she said psychologists, they only work on the mind, whereas social workers, she said it's similar to what you said, about more holistic, look at, the family systems and everything. And I want to stop the class and go outside and go, but we do that as well. Like, it depends, some people might focus more on one area or the other, but we do take a holistic, family systems approach. We try to incorporate culture and societal factors and so on. So I just want people to have the misunderstanding that, that we necessarily focus only on one area. And neuropsychologists would definitely work on the brain. Right. And some people do have a very narrow scope where they do only look at certain factors, and, similar to what you said. But I just want to make people to know that we do have the option, with all of our training, experience, and, knowledge, to be able to have a really broad, holistic approach as well. So those opportunities are there for psychologists. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when Shara was explaining what her scope looks like, I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, well, we do that too. So I'm actually having a hard time discerning really what the difference is between the three of our professions. Because like I said, from the get-go, there's so much overlap. But to speak to what you were saying, Oren, as far as being a registered psychotherapist in Ontario, it's so much more treatment focused. So I, of course, have my bachelor's degree and my master's in counseling psychology. And then to register, you're required to have, of course, I can't remember the number of hours offhand here, but there's a certain number of hours to be able to register to work under supervision. And then much like what you described, after you hit some 1,000-something hours you can practice independently. But it's great because, as Oren said before, the only options were to become a social worker or to become a psychologist. And that doesn't always necessarily fit as far as for somebody who wants to, strictly work in the therapy field.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. So Shara, because I've had students, I've had patients ask me this, so I'm going to ask you directly, because you said you did many years in therapy, like as a therapist,
yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So if someone came to you and said, okay, so, if I want to get psychotherapy, but I'm not going to psychotherapist, even though you are doing psychotherapy because you're a social worker. Okay. If they said, so kind of tell me how, I don't know if it's too general of a question, if you need a specific case, but like if they said, okay, tell me how working with you, how is this going to be different than, let's say, from a psychologist, like, in the actual therapy setting itself, what would you tell them is kind of your different orientation or approach or focus?
Yes, I would want to know what their I would want to know what their experience has been to help them understand it. And it really, for me, I've gotten that question a lot but I was working on a multidisciplinary team. So often my clients would see the psychiatrist first. And then they would see the clinical psychologist, which was our clinical director at the time, for their assessment. And then they would come to us to do the biopsychosocial, and then we would integrate them into outpatient care, or we would give them a higher level of care. So oftentimes that conversation, depending on who the person was and what was their level of understanding, that's because it is pretty general, but I would probably have to think of like a specific case. It's been a couple of years since I had to deal with that. But I once had a schizophrenic ask me, what was the difference between a social worker and a psychologist? And he said, what's the difference between you and the redhead? And I remember, and I said, the difference between me and the redhead is that she runs the show. I'm just the person on the ship. But it's always an interesting overlap because it is, because every discipline, depending on their code of ethics and how they define it, you're fighting with society's perception of that discipline, as well as fighting what it looks like in society as well. Because I don't know if you ever seen the movie Precious. I know this is a little offhand. Mariah Carey plays a social worker. I don't know if you ever seen that movie.
I know of it. I do know.
Yeah, if you just Google what she looked like, she did not look like that Mariah Carey. She looked like someone that was like worn down. I was like, that is not all of us. And it's a perception, at least in social work, that we constantly have to fight. But from a theoretical standpoint, when I think of a psychotherapist, a social worker can be a psychotherapist, depending on what, if they're licensed and certified in that area, at least in the U.S. There may be certain certifications we may have to get in order to be licensed or certified in psychotherapy. But for a psychologist, that's going to be definitely different depending on what their focus is. So when I explain it to people, even though this may be very generalized, for me, it depends on who I'm talking to. Because I'm talking to a schizophrenic who may be here and may not be here, or if I'm talking to someone that's in crisis, or someone that is really struggling or trying to deflect during the initial time where we're trying to get information, and trying to negate and build that rapport with them. Do you know what I mean? So
it's really context specific as far as how you describe it. Yeah. And like you said, working with the multidisciplinary team, the lens within which you're looking at it is different than if you were practicing independently as a psychotherapist, social worker.
Yeah. Most of my time that I've been a psychotherapist has been working on a multidisciplinary team. So I would get the question, but not as much, because most of the time, by the time they got to me, they had seen the nurse, the psychologist, the clinical director, psychiatrist. They may have seen an LPC. We had an MFT on staff, depending on what the modality they needed and who was being treated. If it was family or individual, what was their severity of their case, and really discerning what their level of care should be. So the question wasn't around as much, but we have had that a few times that I was in practice in that type of setting.
Okay, so can I jump in then with a follow-up to two questions? One, you mentioned a couple of...
You're our teacher.
Can't help it. Can't help it. So you mentioned a couple of initials there because you're talking about the multidisciplinary team, and I'm not sure if this is different from this between the United States and Canada, but like I think I heard MMT and LSC.
MFT, Marriage and Family Therapists, LPC,
MFT.
Licensed Professional Counselors.
Okay, so I heard the letters wrong. That's why I didn't make. Gotcha. Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's on me. That's on me. Okay, and then the second question. So that you alluded to it earlier. Aside from the perception that you're just baby snatchers. Okay, what would you say? And I think it's an important question though, because I've had people ask me, what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychic, right? So the lack of knowledge of what we do. So what would you say, aside from that baby snatching line, what would you say is the biggest misperception about social workers in any of the contexts that you work?
The biggest misconception that we don't make any money.
All right.
Yes, that is a big one for us in the U.S. I can tell you that.
Okay.
That we don't make any money at all, that we're always poor. And that is far from the truth of what I've experienced in my business journey. So.
Okay. And by the way, I used to say that to my students as well, and especially now today, especially with psychotherapists. Psychotherapists can charge as much as a psychologist could, and a psychotherapist, again, can be a social worker. So, the payments, in the past, there were larger discrepancies, but I used to tell students even 20 years ago, one of my colleagues who was a social worker, this was, again, when it was unlicensed, but still she was practicing because she was a registered social worker. I said she was charging good money, very good money, and she was never, let's say, lacking in clients because she got lots of referral sources and so on. So I think it's important for people to know that if you have ambition, and I think maybe you can talk to this, Shara, if someone has ambition, if they have the experience, the wherewithal and so on, they can make a good a good living, a very good living doing what you're doing. What do you think is most lucrative or rewarding, either for yourself or for others? Because you've got your whole business, but for someone who's not that, let's say, entrepreneurial minded, what could they do in your field?
I would say, and I tell my own students this, in terms of social work, we have so many transferable skills. So for a bachelor level social worker who's just coming out of college that maybe want to work in mental health, it's really building that clinical toolbox. As a teacher, I'm sure you appreciate this, building your clinical skills at your place of work. In the beginning, you don't make much money starting out, but it's important to get that experience and to seek mentorship and to seek certifications that are evidence-based, but also align with the population that you work with. So if you leave that practice or that first job or second job, you're building a trail for what ultimately could be your pivot point. And that's exactly what happened to me. If I could speak on that part, I have been in social work for about 20 years. And at the end of that journey, I wanted to go in private practice. Of course, I never did, but not in therapy. I was pretty burnt out, but I still wanted to do it because I thought that's all I could do. And I found out very quickly that it was a story that I'd heard on LinkedIn that became my pivot point during the pandemic of not being able to pass my clinical advanced board exam to practice independently that it took me 10 years to get to. In the U.S., it takes 2 years, it took me a decade. And in that journey, I found a new purpose of being able to use my story to pivot, to combine my therapy experience, but also combine my personal experiences of struggles with the licensing part, but also being able to use a more holistic approach that hadn't been done before in the exam prep to help students, especially those that have ADHD like I do, generalized anxiety disorder, which I have, and a learning disorder. I've had a range of students who probably would have really struggled without having a more holistic point to licensure. I had my first deaf and blind student pass their exams the first time, which in the licensing world is a lot harder if you don't have that type of ongoing coaching support where you're meeting and matching someone's learning needs. In the U.S., there's a big fight going on between using self-study programs and tutors, which I always explain to people that I'm neither because of the vast majority of experience that I have that I can holistically match and utilize to that student's learning style, which and the licensing world in the U.S. is a one-size-fit-all mold. And that
Right. So if I can jump in for a second, Shara.
Go ahead.
So you make a really good point as far as, and interestingly enough, Oren and I record an episode about ADHD just the other day, and we talked about that very topic with accommodations for examinations and how incredibly important and life-changing getting the right fit can be. So you mentioned taking a holistic approach to it. What exactly does that mean? Without giving away your secret sauce, because I know this is part of your business.
That's
but
fine.
what would that look like?
So typically, it's more for me. I was diagnosed, I'm 37. So, I was diagnosed 3 years ago. I had it most of my life. Didn't know it. And I'm a high achieving individual. It was pretty much overlooked because of my anxiety. Graduated with honors, top of my class for both my degrees, but the struggle of my memory deficit was horrible. And I didn't really realize my parents couldn't figure out what it was. Third grade, it took me 2 years to even get through multiplication tables. That's how bad it was. And being the child of the 90s, late 80s, my parents didn't have the capacity to know what was going on with the type of brain that I had. And it took a licensing exam for me to get diagnosed with ADHD combined type. And it took me failing an exam to get to that point of knowing that there was something else going on, even though I didn't know what it was. Even though I had, intellectually had been in the world of knowing different learning disorders, I never would have thought I had a neurodevelopmental disorder. I had math learning disorder, and I also had generalized anxiety. The psychiatrist said, your anxiety was so high back then. We saw some of the ADHD, but we couldn't even diagnose it. It's like, well, that would have been great. It would have shown. And she's like, I'm so sorry. You're in your 30s now. You're getting this diagnosis. Man, that probably would have saved you so much grief. But I was like, yeah, it would have. There are many of my clients, my colleagues that have underlying conditions that they don't have the insight, or they don't want to face them. And they think that's like, oh, I can just, go ahead and take this exam. And then when I failed several times, and then I actually was like, hey, looking at your history, I think you need to look at accommodations. I think you need to get assessed. And what they do is like a light bulb goes off, like, wow, thank you, Shara, for having me look at this. No one else has been able to catch this. So looking at it from a holistic point of when people come to me, I'm not only looking at their exam history, I'm looking at, are they a parent? I'm looking at how long they've been out of school. Because some of the barriers with the licensing right now is there's 3 people that don't pass. And this has been a study under ASWB, which is our testing regulatory board, which is a big mess right now in our field in the U.S., where the top people that don't pass are people that don't have English as their first language, people that have been out of school for a long time, older test takers, or from a marginalized community, whether they're Black or Hispanic. So there's something systematically wrong there, and they're trying to address it now. But part of the gap I've been filling is most of my clients have come from a marginalized community, have systematically, historically had issues around standardized testing. So trying to fill that gap and trying to hold the space for them has been important to me, where most tutors would just say, just do practice questions. There's so much more to someone's learning process and cognitive, how they process information. So being able to gauge that for me is a blessing, to be able to push my colleagues a little bit beyond their comfort level to seek help and know that it's okay to do that.
Yeah, and that's really cool coming from your lived experience of knowing what it's like to be a high achiever and be intelligent, but still not quite be able to, get the grades or pass the way that you should be able to. So that's really great.
Right. And as Malini said, we literally just talked about everything you just described, and we were talking about how that does hinder so many people and prevents so many people from being able to actualize their full potential. And I had a couple of questions for you then. I know how it is in Ontario, and the reason I mentioned that is we were lamenting the fact that unless you have a lot of money, at least in Ontario, it's a long time before you're going to get, as a child, as an adolescent, or even as an adult, getting an assessment. It costs a lot of money, and the line, if you can get through school, it could be months, could be years before months is a short, many, many, many months, right? What is it like in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the States? What would you say?
It's expensive. It is expensive. I mean, when I first had a neuropsychological exam, I was going to college around that time. It was like 2006, 2007. And the reason why I had to go see a neuropsychologist was I was told by my math professor that, hey, Shara, I think there's something going, you're not getting your basic math class, you're not passing it, and you're taking this, you're doing everything you're supposed to, but something is off. And I'm like, I'm in the honors program. I'm an honors student. What are you talking about? And I went to the neuropsychologist, and at the age of 21, she's telling me that you have generalized anxiety disorder. Part of it, I think, is being the first person to go to college and not having anyone to really talk to you about that process. The other part was it was a lot of pressure I put on myself. The other part was having to be told you have a learning disorder. Being as though you've been a type A go-getter most of your life, especially in academia where I've done really well. But looking back, I could see the points of where I struggled and often had to compensate for that. So having my son, who I'm constantly watching him for signs of ADHD right now, he's not showing any signs of it. Thank God. There's, of course we know there's genetic uploading that can happen. But part of it for my son is that he's a very nurturing learning environment. He's a straight A student in homeschool. No issues at all. For me, part of it was pathological. My father was a military man, had no patience. I was scared of doing homework with him. So my memories of doing school with my father was horrific. My dad was emotionally and physically abusive. So it, I think, exacerbated whatever symptoms were there at the time. Hence, by the time I got to college, I had a high expectation of myself that was mostly cultivated by that type of pressure and upbringing, especially being the oldest of 5 children. So, of course, sibling position, as we know, influences that can.
Okay. Can I jump in with another question? I was going to do an abstract question based on something you said, but I'm going to use you though, if you don't mind, just because of what you brought up.
Easy, Ruby. Sure.
Okay, so and I hope you'll be able. I don't know if there's a good answer to this, but you were talking about the different, like again, let's say inhibiting factors, and one of them was you were talking about if a person is a person of color, that we know there's systemic barriers and difficulties. So, given everything that you described as far as your personal history, and again, if it's too personal, just let me know, please. But given your personal history and all the dynamics you mentioned, if you were, let's say, white, and I'm not sure, or a white male, and you went to get help, what do you think would have been different as far as, like, again, your pathway toward where you are now, given the difficulties with the ADHD and so on? Do you think there would be something that you could describe as, again, an extra obstacle for you specifically?
I can only speak to, as much as I want to go hypothetical, I can only speak to what my experiences were. Knowing for me, I came from an inner city, environment, grew up with 2 teenage parents in a low income environment, poor public school district. And then having to go to a predominantly white college where, I was thrown into a program where it's mostly students that have been in private school all their life. So it had my first semester, I can tell you, no one saw me. I was always in the library scared of failing. My father said, you shouldn't be in an honors program, you're going to fail. My first semester, I hit the dean's list, but that was because I constantly stayed in my professor's office, using their office hours and asking for help. From what I knew at the time, I was very resourceful, high pressure, but very resourceful when it came to using the supports that were there. And I had I had a lot of people around me that when I opened up to them, that it was supportive. However, not everyone has that same experiences as I did. I did have to fight a lot for what I gained. But what I learned from my personal experience is that, it's important to, one, ask for help, no matter what background you come from. But depending on what your factors are, your ability to cope, if we're talking about resilience, it's a process, right? It's going to be different for everyone, no matter where you come from. I've had Caucasian students who they struggled, and had similar backgrounds, just not the same, cultural background. I do believe, and I have to state, there are systemic barriers. I've experienced them myself, but I've also been one to overcome them with seeking services and asking for help. There's a huge stigma in the African American community when it comes to seeking help, adequate services, as well as if we're talking about academia. We're definitely way behind the mark. Some of that is, a lot of it has to do with, of course, not to go into topic, we're talking about systemic racism. I can speak to that here in the U.S., but overall, I would say asking for help, no matter who you are, where you come from, and using your resources is a start, no matter what the background is.
So if I can ask a follow-up to that. So you mentioned something really interesting, and I agree with you that asking for help is of the utmost importance. Our listeners know, but you may not know, I'm blind. So I've had to really learn how to advocate for myself in the workplace setting, in the academic setting, in the world in general. But I'm wondering, you're mentioning some of the stigma that comes along with it in the African American community. Mm-hmm. I think in general, there is amongst many communities, whether it's the vision loss community, the South Asian community that I belong to, women, I think there is often a lot of stigma that comes along with asking for help. But what in particular can you identify, or what were you referring to when you mentioned that there's stigma in the African American community?
Well, I guess for me, I was thinking about my colleagues and pushing them to seek help. I was one of them. It took me most of my life to get on medication for my disorders. I had never been on ADHD medication. I had never been on anxiety medication. My mother has debilitating anxiety. She's now being treated for it, but she's 53 years old. So some of the vicarious traumas that she experienced, that I experienced through her in my youth, some of the, we have this culture that what goes on in your home stays in your home. You don't talk about it. And that's the culture that I grew up in, very much so. Mm-hmm. It took me most of my life to find my voice to talk about those stories, because I find that those stories are, not just my story, but the story of many that won't ever speak about them. So when I think of stigma, I'm thinking about the strength you have to talk about the very mm-hmm. things that you're ashamed of talking about. It took me, I was very broken after my license experience. I missed it by 2 points. I'll never forget that. A whole year of me getting on LinkedIn, talking about my depression, talking about being broke on food stamps, 3 kids at home, almost being evicted from my home, being scared and losing my job a week before the pandemic, not knowing where my next meal was going to come from, having debilitating headaches, not having health insurance, taking 6 to 8 migraines, Excedrin a day to numb it. And these were really debilitating. I swore, I was like, am I getting like a tumor or something around my head? Because it was very painful. There were times where I couldn't even get out of my bed because I had pushed myself so long. At the time, it was like 17 years to get to this point of getting this license done. And I failed. And now I have this little boy looking at me, who I'm supposed to provide for, and I can't. So when I called my insurance, called around and seeing how I could get insurance, finally got it. I said, I have to do something different. I don't care what I have to do. I don't care what it looks like. I have to do it. I have to pass this thing. And I got a therapist, got on meds, got diagnosed with ADHD, and passed 2 months later. That was 3 years ago.
Yeah. So there's a few things you mentioned there that I think are really key. So one of them, it sounds like out of necessity, things weren't going in the direction that they needed to for you to support your family. So there was some degree of necessity that pushed you forward. I also think that there was this, strong desire to overcome an obstacle. And Oren and I have spoken about this in other episodes before, where oftentimes those who are most successful are those who were told they can't do it. And you mentioned earlier that your dad had alluded to, you're not going to succeed. So I wonder, if that played a role in your desire to push forward and push through and overcome those obstacles.
I always push. There's a dark side to that, though. And it's something I speak about a lot now. There's a perception especially on LinkedIn, where people have watched me the last couple of years get to a place of all these things happening for me now, not knowing the underlying, what's beyond the screen, a shiny profile of a lot of letters, a lot of accolades. And it really talking about some of the grind of what I had to go through to get there. Losing a baby, losing my daughter, having another child who's medically compromised, losing my marriage, going through depression, drinking a lot the first couple of years of my son's existence, while trying to put on the face of being Shara therapist, and then at 5 o'clock rolls around, I am a mess. I am grabbing the only thing I can grab to drown the pieces of my life that are now broken.
Oh my goodness.
So when I look at where I am now, thank God I'm not in the ground. So yes, there was always a push. My son being born and my other 2 stepdaughters, my bonus children, they are what pushed me now. But before, it was just me trying to push a way out.
Well, thank you for sharing, very personal matters.
Yeah.
And Malini and I, we try to model, openness, transparency. We hope some people get, let's say, inspired, motivated by hearing these things. So I'm going to ask a question that Malini and I've talked about before, and I know you part of your practice is working with like DEI, and so when I hear a story like yours, and again I've said this before on our podcast, okay, you would be somebody that I would want to take anybody from any of the different, let's say, marginalized groups that you belong to, and say, here's a model. Here's a role model. Okay, let's not believe that just because you have certain factors, whether again a person of color, a woman, this and that, right? Just you rose above that, right? Like I'd want people to look at examples of people who can achieve, and not to say, well, just pull yourself. I keep saying this to Malini, like not just pull yourself up by your bootstrap. That's ignorant, right? Now but to know that it's possible. Right. So when you think of your role, you were talking about like on LinkedIn and people following your journey, how much of like when you're doing this, are you consciously, or is it just part of you saying, you know what, I want to inspire other people who have been told by the system or their parents or others that they can't achieve? How much is that driving you these days?
That has always driven me. It was just at a point, I think earlier on in my process of finding myself through, even becoming a social worker, before that, a psychologist. I think there was a desire to always wanting to help people that, because of that driving desire of where I came from. It just, I think over time for me has, that desire has morphed, and developed through time as I've changed focus, but still always remembering that, through my journey, I would hope that is a blueprint, the pain, the challenges, the lessons learned. Now that I'm done with them, they're lessons that I can leave for someone that actually needs them, if that makes any sense. I wouldn't want to be like here's a model shining example. I would say here's hope for you to make it what you will. To take something from whatever facet of my journey that can help you in the moment where you feel that you can't make it, that you're in a dark tunnel and you're looking for a candle with, let me be the lighter, even if it's temporarily.
Okay, and 2 more points, if I could just tie together, because you're mentioning your children. Look, I always say that we want to be our children's role models. My kids would laugh if I said that about myself. They mock me all the time. But there are certain elements that I do bring to the table, and I think what you're really describing, and Malini talk about this all the time. And I hate, I could make this a drinking game, but I just, Shar, every week there's a word that I'll repeat like a dozen times. So I haven't done it today, but if I had to, I would choose one word. I always tell parents this: if there's one thing you can teach your children, if you only get to teach one, I say resilience. Okay. And I think that's what you're
Right,
embodying.
funny. That's exactly what I was about to, when you said it, that was the first thing that popped in my head. My son, Jaden, my littlest one, he went through he had a hard time in the beginning. When he was born, I was told that he wouldn't make it beyond 6 months. He had a kidney abnormality that was going to kill him.
Wow.
He'll be 10 next year. He had surgery at 6 months, and a very invasive kidney surgery. It saved his life, but then for the first 4 or 5 years, he was in and out the hospital while I'm trying to rebuild a career after a divorce as a military spouse. And then the pandemic hits. He was homeschooled for a little while. Then he loses his favorite aunt, his uncle. My brother was 18 years old when he got killed last year. It'll be 2 years. He was 18, didn't make it out of my mom's house. Around the corner, we heard shots, and he was laid out in the street. The reason why I tell that story, and I can tell it very in a place of peace and comfort and know he's at peace, is that when I think of my brother Samir and I think of my son, he was so resilient. He processed, he cried, we got him grief counseling, and he made straight A's all the way through night, didn't miss a beat. And I look at him now with everything he's been through, and just like, you're a little resilient little bug. He said, a couple of days ago, he said to me, Mommy, that's because I'm like you. And I said, you know what? You definitely are. When I look at my son, my flesh and blood, I would only hope to cultivate through my experiences what it is to be human, what it is to be kind, what it is to be compassionate. And for I want to say this was a couple of weeks ago, he had a pocket full of change, and we were passing a homeless guy, and he said, Mommy, I got all this change to give him. I was like, what is this? He took all of his money I was picking that was been there for 5 years and gave it to him and said, I just wanted to do something nice, and walked off. And I had to turn away because I just bubbled up tears, but it let me know that I did something that I was planning to see in him, that he wants to help others in whatever way he does that. It lets me know that
it speaks to how important our modeling is to our children. That's beautiful. That's wonderful.
Yeah. Because there were times I would think, I'm not a good parent. I missed his first words. I missed him walking because I was working so much in the hospital. Most of his upbringing I missed. And now to be in a place to spend time with them, to help teach them, to have that freedom is what I fought for all those years ago. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I always say to Malini, and Malini, I've talked about this on podcasts. I'm going to bring sex into it for a second, but as a male, like I always say to people, without my wife, if I was raising children on my own, I don't know how far I would have got or how long it would have taken. Because I got a free pass almost, so to speak. I was always there for my kids. They know I'm always in the house. I've been a very active, participant in their lives. But my wife was the backbone of the family, and like I always tell my kids, without her, you wouldn't be here, basically. So, so when I hear stories, and by the way, and when I used to do my children's aid assessments or the Child Protective Services, and I would see a single mom, 3 or 4 kids, she's sick. She's got to take her kid to school or whatever, or another child's sick and everything. And I just think, how do people do it? So whenever I hear stories of, and again, well, you know what, I'm going to make it a drinking game. Second time, resilience. Whenever I hear stories of resilience, I really, really hope that I hope they take that from what they're seeing, because that it is inspirational. And without that, we as a society don't move forward. We need the people who do have not just the vision, but the resilience, the wherewithal, the ability to carry forward no matter what the hardships are. And, we stumble, we fail, we make lots of mistakes, we screw people up, but, just keep going. So I when I heard your story, like it's very touching, it's moving. And again, I just hope that people, again, really are inspired by that. And would you say, so let me ask you that, I'm just going to sort of turn a little bit of a corner here. So what if you were working with, let's say, a young woman who happened to be, Black, and she was saying, well, I have no choice, or I have no chance, or, the world's stacked against me. What would you say to her? She's intelligent. She's ambitious.
I've had quite a few of those in my. There's a few people I'm thinking of right now. I when I hear that, I usually I used to get into a lot of trouble with this when I was in practice, but self-disclosure for me was a way of connecting with them and building rapport. It was important for me to level that power dynamic. So I would always share a little bit of what my journey has been with her. And oftentimes they're able to see themselves. It may take them a little bit more time because sometimes someone can tell you, hey, you're going to be fine. But when you're in the midst of a storm, sometimes you just can't see. And that's okay because that's where you're supposed to be. It may take somebody else on the outside to be able to guide you through it and sometimes let you sit with it until you're ready to move. And that's how I used to see myself when I was a therapist, because most of the people I work with look like me. But my staff did not. So there was often a cultural disconnect, even though I love my colleagues. But there was a level of connection I had with my clients because I lived in the very areas that they lived. I could understand their cultural background because it was very much mine. So being able to hold the space for them when they were at their most vulnerable point was very powerful for me to help them see that there is hope, and the fact that they were in here when there's so many people that wouldn't even enter the building that I worked at was strength in itself. So I often found myself having those type of conversations with them to find your strength, but also know that you're human and it's okay to break apart. But there's always another day if you're blessed to have it. You just build yourself back up again, and it takes time.
So, Shara, a question for you. I want to segue a little bit into some talk about DEI. So I think that's something the three of us definitely have in common is in our own rights, we've all overcome some significant obstacles and have come out successful in the end. But what do you say to those who then, assume that, perhaps if I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. Let me gather my thoughts for a second because I want to be sensitive and empathetic when I say this. But with DEI initiatives in the workplace, there is often criticism that it's making things easier for some people who come from, difficult backgrounds. And in some ways, I think that there is a great deal of character that is built through pushing through and overcoming obstacles. But from my own experiences, I can also acknowledge the fact that if things were a little bit more level, if the playing field was a little bit more level, perhaps that would have made the road to the end of the journey a little bit more, a little easier to deal with. So what do you say to those who think it's, about making things easier for people?
I guess this is my own personal opinion because I just had this conversation with somebody. It can be very difficult. I think I had this conversation with someone. This is a very sensitive topic for me because I've been in these situations where I've had to talk to people that have no idea what this or don't have the ability or will not cultivate the ability in themselves to be empathetic, to step into someone's shoes, to know what it is to not have your senses, right? One of your senses, or to have a learning disability that creates barriers. It's not an equal level playing field. It's important to understand the importance of cultivating a work environment where everyone feels included. And I think that's definitely up to the people that lead those type of environments, or it can be very toxic because for them, it lessens productivity. It trashes morale, and it does more damage to the company overall. When you don't have that, you're not supporting the people that need it the most. I've had some really, I've had some really difficult conversations with even my former superiors about the importance of diversity and being sensitive to the needs of others in order for the environment to not be hostile, in order for it to be one of productivity, and really teaching emotional intelligence and cultivating insight into people that it's important to be sensitive and to feel valued and respected. Everyone deserves that. So, may not be the complete answer, but there are so many choice words I probably can't say this podcast.
And I can see you're choosing your words as carefully as I did, so I'm with you.
Because, but overall, because I just feel like when you have someone that has that type of fixed mindset, they don't know what it is, or they've never been able to walk in those shoes, and they don't want to. But no comment.
Yeah. So, okay, but here's the challenge. So I'll preface with, I at the heart of it think that DEI initiatives are so important and so valuable. I actually had a friend ask me, because DEI has a bad rap at this point because it's gotten out of hand, I think, in some ways. But someone actually asked me, well, why are you involved in that? Well, I'm a woman of color with a disability and I've overcome a lot. So yeah, I think it's important to ensure that things are fair. But what do you think about some of these initiatives? Or maybe you don't think, but I'm inclined to believe that in some cases it's gone overboard. What do you think about that?
And when you say it's gone overboard in terms of how DEI is looked at overall, I'm just trying to make sure.
I would say how it's executed. Like, I'll give you an example, and this is clearly a really extreme example, but in 2021, Coca-Cola did a DEI training with their staff, and I'm going to actually pull up the slide. So what it's turned into in some cases is anti-white. So this slide that Coca-Cola shared with their staff was to be less white is the goal that they're aspiring to here. So that means to be less oppressive, be less arrogant, be less certain, be less defensive, be less ignorant, be more humble, to listen, to believe, to break with apathy, and to break white solidarity. So for the most part, I think a lot of those things are qualities people should aspire to in general, like listening and being empathetic. But how it's kind of turned into like anti-white rhetoric in some ways, it seems so bizarre and so counter to what the initial goals of DEI were.
You kind of caught me off guard. I kind of lost my words. Trying to figure out how to.
Wait, I'm the one who should be triggered by all that, Shara. I'm getting triggered by hearing all that, not you. Come on.
Well, I say that because most recently I've had some cultural. This is way off the mark, but cultural implications in my own family of looking at my mixed culture. So I found out that in my family, we have a mixture of some European descent and also African, Nigerian. And my mother didn't tell me that because most of my family, colorism is a big thing in a Black community. I'll say this. I know this is off the mark a little bit, but in terms of
that's okay.
If someone is a little bit lighter shade, I'm the lightest one in my family. And there was always a lot of not nice things that people used to call me, even within my own family regarding that. That goes back to slavery, of course, and most recently doing DNA testing and finding other relatives that very much had blue eyes and blonde hair. It was eye-opening for me most recently to connect with those relatives because I felt like I needed to understand more about my culture, being still an African-American community. It's historically mixed because of the mixture of slave owners and slaves and whatnot. But most recently, interesting enough, I was having a conversation with my cousin who actually works for a university in the diversity inclusion department. She's having a very hard time because she's my complexion, and she's having a hard time with just trying to fight some of the experiences of what it means to be deaf, what it is to be African American, and what it is to be feeling that she is getting a lot of anti-rhetoric per se, which I didn't even know was happening. She's had some really nasty things happen to her at work that is really disheartening when you're targeted for trying to fight for people that don't have a voice to fight for themselves, or can't, or are afraid to, because they'll be feeling like they'll be reprimanded. So everything, my mind is just, Malini, everything, my mind is just going 50 miles per minute, because I think it's disheartening that it's important to see the beauty and diversity, no matter what the culture is, but it's also important to understand that everyone's capacity is going to be very different. I just would hope for people listening to the podcast, even though I feel like I'm all over the place in my head, it's important to understand that there's a place for, it's not just a buzz. DEI is not just a buzzword. It's a fundamental principle that I think about when it comes to embracing and improving positive change in the community. I mean, the workplace is just a micro environment that really exemplifies our society as a whole. And it's important that those conversations happen, whether they're uncomfortable or not. I think that was a good response. Calm my brain down.
I'm sorry to have caught you off guard there with that.
Darn, because
You did.
Because I was going to say I had a follow-up question to in hearing you talk, Shara, and I was going to I'm going to throw something at you if it's too difficult. So I'm going to ask, and I'm going to sort of speak on Malini's behalf, right, or for Malini. So, or I'm trying to protect you, Malini. Okay, let's put it this way. So,
okay, yeah, I think I know where you're going with it.
Oh no.
All right. Well, I'm just curious what your thoughts are, because again, I have the least credibility here when it comes to DEI, just from people looking at me. All right, but I know a number of people who have worked in the departments, either where DEI has been implemented or where they are actual DEI agents of change, and oftentimes they're telling me that no matter what the problem happens to be, if there are other factors that might be causing the, let's say, toxic work environment or unproductive work environment or whatever else it is, that all gets trumped by saying, no, DEI, right? And it's not very inclusive, the way that they take, the approach they take. So I was going to ask you, in your professional experience and all the work you do with DEI, either you can take one or two or both, have you seen that where, again, it's good ideas executed poorly, and the second question is, I mean, what do you do about that? How do you help people see that diversity does not have to be just somebody's skin color or their sex or something like that we have to look at what's actually happening, not just assume that it must be this strata of problem, that it might be something else that's going on here, and don't just automatically assume, oh, we need just a few more women here or a few more, people with vision issues here. I threw a whole bunch at you, Shara.
At my former job. No, I'm thinking you got me running in my mind of remembering some of the issues at my old job that we were fighting for more clinicians of color, and at the time, because one of my patients, I remember him saying, why aren't there any black male therapists? I remember that question. And back then I didn't know how to answer that. Now looking back, the answer was very prevalent, but whether my superiors at the time wanted to address it was another story. I would say I've seen companies bring in other people, or when it's too sensitive to touch, bringing in others, other contractors or other people to be the mediator to try to get people to come to a consensus of what is needed. that has had its pros and cons in places that I've worked at. Pros as in having someone to negate between two parties. The con was it was coming from the group really see that was kind of just putting a Band-Aid on it. Like, here, this is what we're doing. But it was more so that they were just trying to plug in a hole. I think it's important in any workplace to really focus on more about inclusion of everyone. However, still focusing on because I think it's going to look different depending on what the work environment is, what the issue is. It's important. I have seen good ideas executed poorly, as you said, but executed poorly at least from my experience, from the point of not only poor execution, poor leadership being not leading from a place of intellectual. This is what I have to do in order to get the team to be more productive. Instead of looking at it as a teaching learning point for everybody. These conversations are very uncomfortable, and I've seen them go good. I've seen people really struggle, but the beauty in that struggle is there's some insight that is gained. Whether people really want to have those conversations is another. I don't know if that even answers your question, but I don't know. It's tough.
Hey, Malini.
Yeah, sure. So I think, there's certainly a great deal of value in the discomfort that comes along with uncomfortable conversations, because when we're uncomfortable, it really makes us think and reflect. So absolutely. But I think, and I don't want to speak for you, Oren, but this is certainly what I think you were getting at, and what I strongly believe is that we are forgetting about diversity of experiences and the important role that plays, as opposed to, the obvious things that make one diverse, like the color of my skin or the fact that I'm a female. So for me, that's a big challenge when it comes to DEI initiatives, is that we are ignoring how important the diverse experiences of white people are as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's always very sensitive. I think when I had this conversation with some of my colleagues and even my relatives, where it's like, what does European mean? What does Caucasian mean? That's an overall, umbrella. There are subgroups, just like for Black people, there may be someone that is Caribbean. There may be someone that is straight from Africa, even Nigerian or Somalian or something. It's important to understand, even implement cultural competence, which I'm sure you guys know all about. In social work, they drill that into us in terms of our code of ethics, but it's important to let your client, of course, be the expert of their culture, that you are there to be to be the sponge. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The experiences of others need to be handled carefully, but the person that's leading those conversations needs to make sure that they're educated and are willing to have those conversations, or find somebody that can. Seeing it get really ugly when the person that's having those conversations, or has been called to have those conversations, that is in charge of those conversations, for them not to go very well if they're not prepared to have them, or their true intentions show. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. And that leads me to another thought, and kind of tying some of the things that we're talking about here, and a very controversial topic. So again, if you're uncomfortable with this next one, we can certainly cut it out. But I want to get your thoughts on the ending of affirmative action, because some Black individuals in the U.S. have commented that, they are happy about this change because it means that, it displays that Black people didn't need the extra help. But given all the things that you've talked about and that we're talking about here today, I get the sense that we would all agree that there's a time and a place for there to be the leveling of the playing field. So if you're comfortable, can you talk a little bit about that?
Not personally very happy with affirmative action, the Supreme Court's decision, because the fact of the reason why it was birthed in the first place, some of the systemic underlying racism and gatekeeping that it happens for communities that are marginalized, that don't have, they're not able to get to those resources. I have a brother right now who is at Columbia University, his first time being in a place like that. And we've been constantly having conversations. I'm thinking of him right now around being a Black man at an Ivy League school. And even though I've never, I didn't matriculate at Ivy League school, I went to Howard University for my master's degree. It was one of those things I knew what it was to be different in an environment that I look around me and everyone else is different, and helping him kind of navigate what that experience is like for him. One, being Black, second, of course, being male. I think, again, he brought up affirmative action. He got in Columbia right around the time they striked it down. And he was talking about people saying that he got in because of it. When he was a stellar student, 4.0, went from a community college and transferred to Columbia. And having to really have a talk with him that there's going to be some uncomfortable situations where you will be the only one. And being able to take those experiences in stride to know that, unfortunately, there are very few of us where you're going. And that was I don't mind saying in a podcast, that was a real conversation me and my brother needed to have, because that was my experience.
Yeah.
On so many layers. I was not a big fan of that at all. However, it did happen. So looking at my children and the opportunities that me and their dad are trying to cultivate to grant them to be able to know that they're good enough, despite what society says about them. I don't know if that, it's very touchy.
It does. And it is. Absolutely it is. And it leads me to a thought, because to my knowledge, we don't have any such thing here in Canada, but I can really reflect on that idea of being perceived as the diversity hire, or you only got here because you got special favor because of, for me, because of my disability, because I'm a woman, whatever. And it's such a diminishing feeling, because it's like, no, I actually overcame all of these things and did damn well for myself. But because of the negative attitude towards some of these initiatives, I think it's really colored the way, no pun intended, colored the way that people look at the success of those who have overcome obstacles of their own. Volition.
Yes, I could relate for sure. Imposter syndrome is definitely real. And even when I talk to my students and they see like, you're positioned very well in your field, and me telling them that if only you knew the fight that I had, the situations or the environments where people would see me and see you got in here because of this, not because of your qualifications. And then having to really cultivate in myself that I was good enough, even now.
Well, I think we've put you through the ringer enough.
Hey, you wanted to be here.
I was like, man, this was an interesting interview. You guys were just cracking out the questions. I'm like, man, I said I was all for this, and what did I just get myself into?
That's what happens when you sit down with two therapists.
Yeah, we're going to give you review cards afterwards. You can see who made you more uncomfortable. Feel free to give us our feedback afterward. But
it's fine.
Just being mindful of time and everything. And we had no idea where the discussion was going to go. We don't usually have guests, but again, we thought it would be a great opportunity. Originally, we thought because of the different fields and to help people help clarify what the different professions do, where the similarities and differences. But I like where the conversation went, and we looked at other topics that again, Malini and I've talked about before, and getting more perspectives, because that's what we're always trying to do. That's what the reason one of the reasons we started the podcast, diversity of perspectives, lived experiences, let's say guidance and so on. So, ideas. So I'm really thankful for having you on, Shara. And Malini, I'm going to let you take over from me before I babble too much.
Yeah. So Shara, we always end our podcast with, kind of a summary of, well, okay, we've thrown so much at our listeners today, but what can they do with this? So if there is, a main takeaway that you want to leave our listeners with, what would that be?
Wow. You guys threw a whole bowl of chicken soup at the viewers and me. I would say, and this is probably going to sound really generic, but the whole time, besides thinking about resilience, I was thinking that life is full of challenges, quite a bit of challenges, no matter who you are, where you come from. But each day that I can wake up and be above ground is always a good day to me. Gratitude is probably the most powerful thing that you can do for yourself and others. What that looks like to you is going to be different. So to the viewers out there, take each day, what comes with it. And hopefully at the end of that day, there is a lesson or a blessing or a moment that you may cringe at that you can look at the silver lining in there. In the conversation we talked about a lot of things, but the one thing that holds true is the ability to keep stepping forward no matter what's in front of you.
And what's that word again, Shara?
Resilience, yes.
I have to justify my drinking game. So.
Resilience, yes. Yeah, no, that was beautifully put, Shara. So thank you so much for being on the show today. Thank you for answering our questions and having such a robust discussion with us. We want to know what our listeners think as well. So leave us your comments, leave us your questions.
Okay. And from my end, first of all, Shara's information will be listed in the description so they can check out your work. They can see what you do. And I want to also extend my gratitude for joining us. I really appreciate that and putting up with all of our questions. And all right, really appreciate it.
No problem.
All right. And so for everyone else, until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.